A runaway bride, fainted at the station, but the cowboy married her without asking who she was. The cowboy had only stepped onto the station platform to check the afternoon mailbag when a blur of white lace crashed into the corner of his vision, and before he could register more than the slash of a torn hem and a pair of trembling hands clutching a carpetbag, the young bride stumbled, swayed once like a candle in wind, and collapsed right at his boots, her veil slipping sideways as her body folded in on itself with a soft, terrifying thud that silenced every conversation on the platform. Passengers froze mid-stride, the telegraph operator lifted his head in alarm, and even the locomotive's slow hissing seemed to hush as the cowboy dropped to one knee beside her, brushing dirt away from her cheek, while her pulse fluttered beneath his fingers like a trapped bird begging for release. Her dress, once clearly meant for a ceremony she hadn't reached, was dust-streaked and torn at the hem, the bodice creased as though she'd spent miles running rather than walking, and the faint imprint of rope burns on her wrists made his stomach tighten with a quiet, restrained fury he didn't allow to reach his face. The station master muttered something about runaway brides bringing trouble, but the cowboy ignored him entirely, focusing instead on the shallow rise and fall of her breaths and the slight shiver in her shoulders as the warm afternoon light shifted across her. When he tried to lift her gently to sit, the carpetbag slipped from her grasp and burst open, scattering nothing but a thin shawl, a small worn Bible, and a single envelope with no name. No trinkets, no belongings, nothing of a woman who expected a future wherever she had come from. A handful of men edged closer, already whispering about scandal, and a woman near the ticket counter clucked her tongue as though fainting brides were inconveniences rather than human beings in distress. Ignoring them all, the cowboy slid one arm beneath the fainted bride's shoulders, shielding her from their stares as he raised her slightly, his voice low and steady as he called for water. But the crowd's hesitation made clear no one intended to help. So he reached for his own canteen, uncapped it with one swift motion, and let a small trickle touch her lips. She stirred, barely, a soft sound escaping her before she sagged again into stillness. And while the murmurs grew, turning sharper as someone muttered about sending for the sheriff, the cowboy made a decision without hesitation, without second thoughts, without asking himself why. Until she woke, until she could stand, until she could speak, she would not be alone on this platform. Not while he was here, not while she lay half-conscious in the dust with strangers deciding her story before she could tell it. By the time the bride's lashes fluttered in a faint attempt to wake, the platform had shifted from curiosity to judgment, and whispers coiled through the warm air like thin, poisonous threads. Runaway. Trouble. Who's she hiding from? Why faint here of all places? But the cowboy stayed kneeling beside her, steady as a fence post in storm winds, blocking enough of the crowd's view that she could breathe without a dozen strangers studying the rise and fall of her chest. When her eyes finally parted, not fully, just enough to show two thin slivers of confusion, she reached weakly toward the scattered contents of her bag, fingers trembling as though every movement cost more strength than she had left. He collected the shawl for her and draped it over her shoulders before she could apologize for anything, and the subtle way her hand curled around the fabric told him she wasn't accustomed to kindness arriving before fear. The station master approached with the rigid posture of a man who believed rules mattered more than people, clearing his throat as he tapped the badge pinned crookedly to his vest. "Cowboy," he said sharply, "we can't have her lying here like some spectacle. If she brings trouble, I won't have it inside my station." The cowboy met his gaze with a level, unblinking calm. "She's not trouble," he answered. "She's exhausted." But the murmurs behind them grew thicker, meaner, as a few ranch hands drifted closer, sniffing out a story they hoped would give them something to brag about at the saloon later. One of them pointed at the faint rope marks along the bride's wrist, smirking as he nudged his friend. "Looks like she bolted," he said loudly, making sure she heard even in her half-conscious state. "Bet someone's missing their bride right about now." Her eyes snapped open fully at that, panic flooding them so quickly it stole her breath. She pressed back against the wooden post behind her, knuckles white around the shawl, as though bracing against a blow. The cowboy leaned slightly in front of her. Not touching, not crowding, just shifting his stance so she saw him instead of the men watching her like a fallen coin. "No one's laying a hand on her," he said quietly, and though his tone was low, something in it made the ranch hands hesitate. But the station master wasn't finished. "If she's running from a marriage," he said stiffly, "the sheriff will have questions, and she'll answer them." Her breathing hitched, fear shaking through her like a chill she couldn't outrun. The cowboy saw it, understood it, and made another quiet decision he didn't announce to the crowd. Whatever she had escaped, whatever waited behind her fainting and torn dress, he would not let it claim her again. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew danger when he saw it hiding behind a woman's silence. She still couldn't speak, not because she refused, but because fear had tightened around her throat like a rope she'd only just escaped. So when the cowboy rose slowly and extended his hand toward her, palm steady and open, the entire platform stilled, as if waiting to see whether she would trust a stranger more than the world she'd run from. She didn't take his hand at first. Her gaze drifted from his calloused fingers to the crowd, to the station master scowling, to the ranch hands whispering with greedy curiosity, then back to the cowboy, whose eyes held not demand, not pressure, but a quiet patience that didn't rush her into explanation or shame. She reached out, hesitant, trembling, yet stopped inches short of his palm, her breath shuddering in uncertainty. The cowboy didn't move closer. He simply lowered his hand a little, making the gesture less imposing, and waited with the kind of stillness that told her she could decide without consequence. Slowly, she lifted her fingers again, brushing his palm with the softest, most tentative touch, and something in her posture loosened the way a locked door shifts when the right key finally rests against the metal. He closed his hand just enough to help her rise, nothing more, guiding her with the gentleness of a man who'd learned long ago that force solved only the problems it created. As she stood, her knees buckled, and for a breath she swayed forward, bracing one hand against his chest. Not a choice, not an invitation, just instinct. The moment froze them both. She quickly pulled away, cheeks flushing beneath the dust, but he didn't flinch or read meaning where none belonged. Instead, he turned slightly so his shoulder shielded her from the nearest onlookers, giving her room to breathe. A mother holding a toddler paused nearby, studying the bride's torn dress and unsteady stance with softening eyes, but said nothing. A telegraph clerk peeked from the doorway, curious but cautious. Only the crowd's whispering seemed loud, the sound pressing against her like another threat she couldn't outrun. Without speaking, the cowboy bent down, gathered her scattered belongings, and placed them gently into her carpet bag. When he handed it back, their fingers touched again. Brief, accidental, but steadying in a way neither expected. She didn't thank him aloud. She didn't need to. Her eyes held a fragile plea, a question she was too afraid to shape. "Will you help me, even if you never learn why I ran?" And his quiet nod, barely a tilt of his head, became the wordless answer she desperately needed. The moment she stood, still unsteady, still clinging to the edge of breath, the crowd moved in again. Not with hands, but with eyes. Hundreds of small, cutting questions that scraped over her skin like sand against raw wounds, and the cowboy shifted subtly to block as many stares as one man could, placing himself between her trembling figure and the station's tightening semicircle. A ranch hand stepped forward first, leaning on his belt buckle as though her fear were entertainment, not suffering. "If she's run off from a groom," he drawled, "he'll be looking for her. Ain't right for a woman to vanish without explaining herself." The bride flinched, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if it could hide the rope marks or the terror flickering in her eyes. She tried to speak, lips parting, but the words collapsed before they reached her tongue. The station master folded his arms, irritation sharpening his voice. "Cowboy, she can't stay here. Sheriff'll need to know her name, her town, her husband. If she's bringing trouble, we aren't sheltering it." Her breathing hitched at the word husband, and the cowboy caught it. A tiny, broken inhale that told him more about her past than any confession could. He stepped forward, his stance straight and unapologetic. "She's fainted, she's scared, and she's not answering questions now." "And who are you to say that?" someone snapped. "Her kin?" "No," he answered, calm but unyielding. "Just someone who sees she's been pushed far enough." A ripple moved through the crowd, not approval, not agreement, but the uneasy shift of people confronted with compassion they hadn't offered themselves. Still, curiosity burned hotter than decency. A woman with sharp eyes pointed at the bride's torn hem. "Why's your dress ripped like that? Did you run from the altar? From a man? From the law?" The bride staggered back, breath coming too fast now, panic rising under her skin like wildfire. Her fingers dug into the cowboy's sleeve, not pulling, not claiming, just trying not to crumble again. He steadied her with the barest touch at her elbow, a silent reassurance meant only for her. "Enough," he said, voice low. "Let her stand. Let her breathe, and let her have a moment without strangers deciding who she is." But the station master, determined to reassert authority, lifted his chin. "If she can't speak for herself, then she'll wait inside until the sheriff comes to sort it out." Her whole body recoiled at the threat of confinement, the carpetbag trembling in her grip. And though she didn't say a word, the cowboy heard everything she was too terrified to voice. She didn't need a sheriff. She needed a way out, and she needed it now. Did it. Before the station master could reach for her, the bride sagged again, her knees folding as though her body couldn't withstand one more question, one more stare, one more threat of being handed back to whatever she had run from. The cowboy caught her before she hit the planks, one arm steady around her back, guiding her toward the only patch of shade along the wall where the heat wouldn't steal the rest of her strength. The crowd followed, but at a distance now, their curiosity colliding with a sliver of conscience they hadn't felt moments earlier. She tried to sit upright on her own, bracing one trembling hand on the bench, but the cowboy knelt beside her, uncapped his canteen again, and lifted it toward her lips with a quiet patience that carried no ownership, only concern. She drank in small, shaking sips, her lashes lowering as cool water steadied her, and the tension in her shoulders eased just enough for him to see she wasn't weak. She was worn down by something far heavier than exhaustion. He noticed the frayed stitching along the waist of her dress, the faint fingerprint-shaped bruises on her upper arm, the way she flinched every time footsteps sounded behind her. These weren't signs of a runaway fleeing cold feet. These were signs of escape. When she swayed again, he folded his coat into a makeshift cushion and set it behind her back, adjusting it carefully so it supported her without trapping her. She looked at him then. Really looked, her gaze flickering between disbelief and a fragile, painful gratitude, as though no one had cared for her without a demand attached in a very long time. The ranch hands muttered their disapproval from a safer distance now, but their earlier confidence had faded. Even the woman who'd questioned her dress earlier softened, clutching her own shawl as if ashamed of how quickly she had judged. The station master hovered nearby, frustrated but less certain of himself, shifting his weight as he realized the cowboy had turned public scrutiny into something uncomfortably close to public shame. For them, not for her. "She can't stay out here," he said, but the edge in his voice faltered. The bride pressed a hand to her temple, breath uneven. Her lips parted, and for the first time she tried, truly tried, to speak, but only a strained whisper escaped, shaped by fear rather than words. The cowboy shook his head gently. "Don't force it," he murmured. "You're safe, for now." Safe. The word made her eyes fill, not with tears, but with an ache that looked older than the tracks stretching beyond the station. She wasn't safe yet. She didn't believe she could be. But for the first time since she'd stepped off whatever train she'd come from, she didn't faint from fear. She fainted into care. The sheriff finally arrived. Dust on his boots, irritation already tightening his jaw as he approached the shaded corner where the bride sat propped against the cowboy's folded coat. And the crowd parted eagerly, hungry for the authority that might force the answers they weren't getting. But the moment his gaze landed on her pale face, the tremble in her hands, and the faint bruises shadowing her skin, something in his posture shifted from annoyance to wary calculation. "Name?" he asked sharply. But she froze, lips barely parting before fear strangled the sound. She tried again, the whisper breaking before it formed, and the sheriff's frown deepened as though her silence was defiance rather than desperation. The cowboy stood, placing himself subtly between her and the lawman. "Sheriff, she fainted twice and hasn't caught her breath. Don't push her." "A woman running in a wedding dress with bruises on her arms is already pushed," the sheriff muttered. "If someone's looking for her, I need to know before they come storming through town." Her shoulders crumpled inward, panic rippling through her so visibly the cowboy felt it like a blow. She clutched the envelope from her carpet bag to her chest as though it were the last piece of herself she still owned. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, cowboy. Without a name or a place, I can't protect her from whoever she ran from." And that was the moment. Subtle, quiet, barely noticed. When the cowboy made a choice he would not undo, even if given every chance in the world. He turned toward the station master's desk, reached for the marriage ledger lying open from earlier transactions, dipped the quill with a steady hand, and wrote his name beside hers, even though her space remained blank, even though she had spoken nothing, even though the crowd gasped at the audacity of it. The bride's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching as though the air itself had betrayed her. But the cowboy didn't look at her yet. He waited for the sheriff's reaction. The sheriff stared at the ink drying on the page, disbelief tightening his features. "You just signed a legal union with a woman who hasn't said one word." "I signed protection," the cowboy answered quietly. "If someone comes for her, they'll answer to me first." The bride pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, fear, confusion, gratitude, all tangled in a single broken gesture. But the cowboy finally met her eyes with a steady calm that said everything she could not. You don't owe me your story. You don't owe me your trust. But you will not face whatever hunted you alone. And though she could not breathe one syllable in response, the way her fingers loosened around the envelope told him she had heard every word. The sheriff had barely finished processing the cowboy's quiet defiance when the distant whistle of an approaching train carved through the heat-heavy afternoon, its low tremor spreading across the tracks like a warning neither of them wished to hear. The bride stiffened instantly, her fingers crushing the envelope against her chest as though the very sound of iron on steel carried the footsteps of the man she had fled from, and the cowboy felt the shift in her body before he saw the terror in her eyes. A terror so raw it made his jaw tighten in a way the crowd mistook for impatience, not the silent promise of someone preparing to stand between danger and the fainting woman he barely knew. The locomotive hissed, brakes screeching as it pulled into the station, and passengers leaned from windows while curious faces crowded the doors. But she didn't watch them. Her gaze locked on the far end of the platform, where a tall man in a fine vest and polished boots stepped down before the train had fully stopped, scanning the area with the frigid precision of someone who believed the world owed him obedience. She shrank back instantly, shoulders curling in, breath breaking in a thin, sharp sound that told the cowboy more than any explanation she could have spoken aloud. "That him?" he murmured, voice low, but she shook her head, not in denial, but in fear of acknowledging it. The sheriff followed the line of her stare and stiffened. "That man's from the East," he muttered. "Carries himself like someone who buys answers instead of asking for them." The groom, because nothing else fit the cold claim in his eyes, strode toward them, not bothering with greetings, scanning the bride's torn dress with a disgust that made her flinch so violently she nearly slipped from the bench. "You!" he snapped at her, ignoring everyone except the woman he believed he owned. "You will come with me now. You've caused enough embarrassment." The cowboy stepped in front of her before the groom could reach her, planting his boots firmly in the dust, hands loose at his sides but ready. "She's not going anywhere with you." "And who are you?" the man demanded. "Her husband," the cowboy answered, calm as a church bell at dawn. The groom froze, stunned, then enraged, but the sheriff lifted the ledger the cowboy had signed, shaking it slightly. "Legal as any union in this county," he said. The groom scoffed, fury tightening his jaw. "She belongs to me." The bride let out a tiny sound, half sob, half apology. But the cowboy didn't move. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said, "and she's not leaving this platform in fear." For the first time, the groom hesitated, thrown by a resistance he hadn't expected, and the bride, still trembling, exhaled as though someone had opened a window she'd long believed was nailed shut. The groom recovered from his shock quickly. Men like him always did, straightening his vest as though the dust on the platform offended him more than the terror shaking through the woman he'd hunted across counties, and he stepped toward the cowboy with the entitlement of someone who'd never been told no in his life. "Move aside," he ordered, voice sharp enough to cut the air. "She is contracted to me, paid for, promised." The bride recoiled at that word, pulling the shawl tighter around herself as if it could erase the memory of whatever transaction had stolen her freedom. And the cowboy's jaw locked so tightly, a vein pulsed at the edge of his temple. The crowd, sensing the tension sharpening to a blade, drew closer, some eager for spectacle, others uncomfortable with the claim the groom made so casually. The sheriff lifted a hand. "Sir, this woman is legally wed in this county. You can contest it in court." "Court!" the groom barked, laughing without humor. "I do not answer to barns and backwater offices. She is mine by agreement." Those words landed like a stone in the dust, heavy and ugly. The bride's breath broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as though swallowing a sob that threatened to make her faint again. The cowboy didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't put a hand on his gun. Instead, he stepped forward, one quiet, deliberate pace that placed him between her and the man she feared, with a steadiness that drew every eye on the platform. "She is not property," he said, voice low but carrying, "and she will not be dragged anywhere today." The groom sneered. "You don't even know her name." "I don't need it to know she's terrified," the cowboy answered, "and that's enough." The groom lunged, grabbing for the bride's wrist, but she stumbled back with a cry, slamming into the bench as panic flooded her so fiercely she couldn't breathe. The cowboy's hand shot out, catching the groom's arm before he could touch her, grip unyielding as iron. The crowd gasped. The sheriff moved in, but the cowboy didn't shove, didn't strike. He simply held the man still, his voice quieter than a whisper, yet more dangerous than a shout. "If you lay a hand on her," he said, "you won't like who you meet on the other side of that choice." Something shifted then. Not in the cowboy, who remained steady, but in the crowd itself. The same townsfolk who doubted the bride moments before now stepped subtly closer to her, forming a loose wall of bodies that made it clear she wasn't standing alone. And the groom, realizing the platform no longer tilted in his favor, hesitated for the first time. In that heartbeat of uncertainty, the bride lifted her eyes toward the cowboy, not in plea, not in dependence, but in the fragile recognition of someone who'd finally found a moment of protection she had never expected to deserve. The groom's hesitation cracked the moment like a thin sheet of ice, and the entire platform sensed it. The shift from his unstoppable pursuit to something brittle, something uncertain, something that no longer bent the world in his favor. The sheriff stepped forward, hand near his holster, not because he expected violence, but because he finally understood who here was actually in danger. "Sir," he said firmly, "this platform is under my jurisdiction. Your claim isn't law here." The groom's face flushed, rage pulsing in tight, uneven breaths. "She is bound to me," he insisted, as though repeating it made it true. "She was promised." The bride's entire frame shuddered at that word. Promised, her grip on the shawl tightening until her knuckles whitened. The cowboy saw it, and without touching her, he angled slightly so she had space to breathe without being trapped by the groom's stare. "A promise made in fear," the cowboy said quietly, "isn't a promise. It's captivity." Murmurs spread through the crowd, not mocking this time, not curious, but uncomfortable in a way that meant they finally saw what she'd been running from. A woman near the telegraph office whispered, "Poor thing," while an older man muttered, "No one should claim a wife like he's buying livestock." The groom turned on the sheriff. "You will arrest him." "For what?" the sheriff replied. "Standing still?" When that failed, the groom pointed a shaking finger at the bride, fury overtaking his polished composure. "She fled from vows, from responsibility, from me." The bride's breath hitched, and she looked down, not from guilt, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had run until her body quit before her fear did. The cowboy watched her, watched the shame that didn't belong to her settle anyway. And then he did the one thing no one expected. Not the sheriff, not the crowd, not even the trembling woman gripping her shawl like a lifeline. He turned to her, not the groom. "You don't have to stay tied to anything that hurts you," he said softly. "But you also don't have to stay tied to me just because I signed that ledger." Her eyes snapped up, startled. The groom's jaw dropped in disbelief. The cowboy continued, voice steady and low, meant only for her, though the crowd strained to hear. "If you want to walk away, right now, I'll tell the sheriff to void it. I'll walk you to the next train myself. No questions, no debts." The bride's lips parted, a tremor running through her as though no one had ever placed her choice in her own hands before. The groom sputtered, reaching for outrage he couldn't shape. The sheriff watched in stunned silence. And the platform, for the first time since she collapsed on it, stilled not for danger, not for judgment, but for a decision that belonged only to her. She pressed a trembling hand to the cowboy's sleeve, not to hold him, but to steady herself. And in that gentle, fragile gesture, her answer took shape before she ever spoke a word. The platform seemed to hold its breath as the bride stood there, trembling but upright, her fingers still resting lightly on the cowboy's sleeve, not in dependence, but in the fragile steadiness of someone taking her first step on ground that finally felt like hers. The groom waited with a rigid certainty that she would return to him out of habit, fear, or some empty obligation, while the sheriff watched with hands hovering near his belt, and the crowd hovered in a widening hush. But the only person she looked at was the cowboy, the man who had given her the one thing no one else ever had: a choice. Her lips parted, and a tiny shake of her head escaped, not toward the cowboy, but toward the groom, who stiffened as though the air itself had hit him. She stepped back from the life she'd been forced toward, letting the shawl fall loosely around her shoulders as she met the groom's furious stare with a courage she didn't realize she possessed until this moment. The groom surged forward, rage tightening every line of his face, but the sheriff finally moved between them, blocking his path with a sternness he should have shown earlier. "That's enough," he said. "She's not going anywhere with you today." "This is outrageous," the groom barked, pointing a shaking finger at the bride. "She was promised." "She isn't promised anymore," the cowboy interrupted quietly, stepping beside her, not touching, not crowding, just near enough that she could feel safety rather than threat. "And she isn't hunted anymore." The bride's breath shuddered with relief, her hands lowering slowly from her chest as though she were setting down a burden she'd carried for far too many miles. The groom sputtered threats he couldn't enforce. The sheriff escorted him toward his train with the kind of firm grip that made it clear his authority had limits the groom had just discovered. When the final whistle blew and the locomotive lurched forward, carrying her past away on iron wheels, the bride sagged onto the bench, overwhelmed. But this time, she didn't faint. She breathed. Small, trembling, but free. The cowboy sat beside her, leaving a respectful space. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. She looked at him, tears filling, not of fear, but of release, and shook her head gently. Then, for the first time, she spoke, just one word, quiet, shaped with gratitude, steadier than the air around them. "Stay." It wasn't a vow. It wasn't romance. It wasn't a promise. It was a beginning. And as dawn light spilled across the platform, warm, soft, unstained by fear, the cowboy tipped his hat, giving her the smallest, gentlest nod. "As long as you want," he answered, and for the first time since she fled her past, the day began instead of ending. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did or walked on? Tell us in the comments.